Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So we want to finish up with our discussion of economic growth that we started last time. So remember that when we have economic growth, one of the things that's happening is the country's production possibilities frontier is expanding outward. Now that growth can be either in the industry in which we already have a comparative advantage, that is the good in which we export, and if that's the bias of our growth, we would refer to that as export bias growth. So again, this is just telling us that most of the growth itself is coming primarily in the industry where we're already exporting. This, of course, should also increase the relative supply of our export good on the world market, and that will lower the relative price of our export good, which is a deterioration in our terms of trade, so that from the international trade perspective, we're actually a little bit worse off. So we don't accrue all of the benefits of the economic growth because of the decline in the price of our export goods. It's also possible, of course, to have growth that is biased towards our import good. So if that's the case, then we will be producing more of our import good. So we can think of that as an increase in the world relative supply of our import good, which is just the opposite of a reduction in the relative supply of our export good. So the world relative supply curve will shift to the left in this case. This will raise the relative price of our export good, which raises our terms of trade and increases our economic welfare from the international effects. So when we have import bias growth, we actually get two positive effects. The first positive effect from the economic growth itself, and then we also get a small additional positive effect coming from an improvement in our terms of trade. Export bias growth, we still have the positive effects that are coming from economic growth directly, but then we lose a little bit of that because of the deterioration in our terms of trade. So it's easy to say then that export biased growth will worsen a growing company's terms of trade. Now, don't confuse this with thinking that growth makes the country worse off absolutely. That is definitely not the case. It's only that the trade, the implications from the trade by changing relative prices, is going to subtract a little from the positive aspects of that economic growth itself. It does, of course, rebound to the benefit of those countries that are importing our export good, right? Our import partners. So if the relative price of our exports is going down, that also means the relative price of other countries' imports is going down. And that's therefore their terms of trade are actually improving. Similarly, import bias growth will improve a growing country's terms of trade, and it does so at the expense of the rest of the world. In essence, what we're doing is we're substituting domestic production for some of our imported goods. And therefore, the price of imports on the world market are going to fall, and that means, again, the relative price of our exports, our terms of trade, have improved. So again, we're better off while the world is a little bit worse off. Notice that once we're talking about terms of trade and changes in relative prices, there are gains and there are losses that are associated between the importers and the exporters. But since changes in trade always lead to a rise in relative prices for one country and a fall for the other, one country will actually have a gain and the other one will actually have a loss from this interchange. So let me jump to slide 27 here first, just to re-emphasize this. Export bias growth, our own export bias growth, worsens our terms of trade. So what we could say is export bias growth is going to increase the relative supply of our export good, right? Which will lead to a decline in the relative price of our export good, which is a decline in our terms of trade, which is also a decline in our aggregate economic welfare. And import bias growth works just the opposite. So when we have import bias growth, we have a fall in the relative supply of our export good. We're producing more of our imported good, so the relative supply of exports has gone down, which leads to an increase in the relative price of our export good, an increase in our terms of trade, and an increase in our aggregate economic welfare. So knowing something about the bias of growth, actually in our own country, tells us something about what the international trade effects will be. So as an example, think about China over the last 10 or 15 years. China has grown very rapidly, averaging roughly 10% growth per year for the last 10 or 15 years, and their growth has been predominantly export biased. So what does that tell us? Export biased growth from China increases the world relative supply of Chinese exports. So the relative price of Chinese exports will fall. The terms of trade will decline, and China's aggregate economic welfare from the international trade effects will also be reduced. Notice, China's not worse off because of this rapid economic growth. Heavens, they're well ahead of the curve on this. It's just that they have falling prices for their export goods, and that's actually subtracting a little bit from what otherwise would have been the case with just the growth itself. So that's an example of how we can look at export bias growth in the case of China. Import bias growth, we can think of Brazil. Brazil is a net importer of crude oil. But one of the things that Brazil has been pushing very aggressively recently is an expansion of its own domestic oil production. It's been looking offshore and deep water drilling, it's been looking on land, and they found a number of oil deposits, and their imports of oil, consequently, have fallen because their domestic production has risen quite significantly. So this is an import still for Brazil, but that's been the bias of their growth. So from Brazil's perspective, what we see is the price of oil to them has lower, which means the relative price of Brazilian exports has increased. And so a higher price for exports means an improvement in the terms of trade, and consequently an increase in Brazil's aggregate economic welfare from that international trade effect. So there's two examples of export bias growth in the case of China, and import bias growth, at least in the case of the oil industry in Brazil. Now what we just talked about was what happens when the growth is taking place in our country. Now let's back up a slide and ask ourselves the same question about what happens if the export bias growth is taking place in the rest of the world. Now here we have to be a little careful about what the terminology is telling us, right? These are export bias growth in the rest of the world. So when they are exporting in the rest of the world, they really are imports. So these would be our imports. So in this case, what's happening? And we want to think about this. We want to think about this in terms of our exports, right? Because we want to think about it in terms of trade, which are always the price of our exports versus the price of our imports. So in this case, when the rest of the world has export bias growth, we could think about that as import bias growth from or additional supply of our imports. So that means then that the relative supply of our exports has gone down, right? So let me just see if I can say this very clearly. If the rest of the world is increasing their exports are our imports. So there's an increase, from our perspective, there's an increase in the world relative supply of imports, which means that there is a decrease in the world relative supply of our exports. If our relative supply of exports is going down, then the relative price of our exports should rise. That will tell us that our terms of trade will increase, which means that we've had an improvement in our aggregate economic welfare. So again, let's go back to the China example that we had before, right? So we import a lot of things from China. So when China has export-oriented growth, which is what they've had, those exports are our imports. Well, we just saw earlier that if China's growing very rapidly on the export side, it's increasing the relative supply of their exports, our imports. So the relative price of their exports, our imports, goes down, which means our exports are more valuable. Our terms of trade improve, and our aggregate economic welfare improves. In essence, what's happened is China's growing very rapidly. They lose some from international trade because their supply of their exports on the world market has increased. We, as the importers, get to take advantage of that through lower prices. So if you look at the price of imported goods from China into the United States, what you would see is that there's been a steady fall over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. So we're better off for this rapid economic growth that's been on China's behalf. And of course, it works just the opposite if it's import bias growth in the rest of the world. Because import bias growth in the rest of the world means our exports. So the rest of the world then is growing in terms of the good in which we export. So one way of thinking about that is we now have more competition in the rest of the world for whatever it is that we're exporting. So the U.S., for example, has seen tremendous growth in our exports of commercial aircraft. Right? But if China starts to grow very rapidly by building a commercial aircraft industry, guess what? We probably won't sell as many airplanes to them. So that would be an example of China seeing import bias growth, growing in an industry in which they're primarily importing, but their imports are our exports. So the relative supply of our exports, it's our exports here, our exports, will actually go up, which means the relative price of our exports will go down, our terms of trade will fall, and we would see a decline in our aggregate economic welfare. Now again, I don't want to imply that growth is bad. It's clearly not bad for the country that's growing very rapidly. But international trade, depending upon the bias of that growth, can either be an additional increment to that benefit or can actually take off a little bit from that increment or from that growth. Even in the case where the rest of the world is growing, even if it's import bias growth, when we think about the loss of aggregate economic welfare that's coming because of changes in relative prices. So we would say, oh, this is bad for the U.S. But guess what? The U.S. is going to sell a lot more airplanes to China after they've grown 10% per year for 15 years than if they had stagnated or grown 2% per year for the last 15 years. Right? They're much wealthier, so they're still going to buy a lot more airplanes. So remember, we're talking relative supplies, not absolute supplies. So it's not as if the U.S. has necessarily lost its comparative advantage in commercial aircraft. Okay. Any questions about economic growth and international trade? Yes? Yes. So one example would be Brazil on agricultural products. So Brazil for years and years had a very inefficient agricultural sector up until about 15 years ago, maybe 20 now. And now they are one of the major agricultural exporters in the world. And it was primarily because they had massive import-oriented or import-biased growth oriented towards the export sector, towards the import sector originally. So they went from import-biased growth, then they became an exporter, now they have export-biased growth in agriculture. So notice that tells you that the shape of Brazil's production possibilities frontier has changed from what we would have seen in the 60s, 70s to what we would have seen in the 90s and the 2000s. So many countries can go through this switch from being a net importer of a product to being a net exporter, or from being a net exporter to becoming a net importer. Iran, just to give you another example, Iran used to actually export refined petroleum products. Iran today actually imports refined petroleum products. Indonesia used to export crude oil. Today, Indonesia imports crude oil. So you can have all sorts of different scenarios, and you're giving me wonderful ideas for problem set questions. Did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, so I was wondering if they ever tried to bring back that growth when it starts to become important, then their economic welfare would not.
They wouldn't for that reason. They wouldn't for that reason. Again, the benefit from the economic growth is going to be multiple times larger than the loss that you're going to see from the change in the terms of trade. So remember that when you have economic growth, all of those gains are accruing to the domestic economy, right? Because when you're growing, you're producing more output, which is also generating a lot more income. What's happening on the global market, remember, the world relative supply and demands are changing, which is changing the relative prices. But those changes in relative prices from that type of economic growth are generally fairly small. And so we don't want to get overwhelmed with this whole notion that the terms of trade might move against us if we have import bias growth in the rest of the world or export bias growth domestically. Growth is always good. Notice I said growth, not greed. Growth is always good. Sometimes it can be even better. Sometimes it can be a little bit worse. So another hand. Yes?
The other case, which is export bias growth in our own country.
Uh-huh.
So the relative supply increases.
Right.
The relative price increases. When the country like China suppresses their exchange rate, that further lowers the relative price of their export. How does that end up impacting the
No, this is, well, the relative price here is the exchange. We're not actually talking about, we are not necessarily talking about monetary prices here. We're talking about how many units of the exported good do we have to give up for how many units of the imported good. So exchange rates per se don't necessarily affect that volume exchange. They might, but it would be through a different channel. Okay. Anything else on economic growth and international trade? Yes?
What products are natural resources or products that are specialized that can't necessarily be produced in other nations?
Lucky you, right? Isn't that what you want to have? No competition.
And even if there's like, certain natural resources can only be taken out from certain areas, so does that really affect them? Where the supply is going?
Well, sure. So let me give you an example. China, there are areas in Inner Mongolia where, for certain what they call rare earth minerals, and don't ask me to pronounce any of them, but they're used in things like solar panels and catalytic converters and all sorts of other kinds of weird things. But they're called rare earth minerals. Okay, so this is stuff you dig out of the ground. As best we know from the known reserves in the world, Inner Mongolia of some of these minerals has 90 to 95% of the world's supply. So in essence, Mongolia is the only producer out there, right? But if Inner Mongolia decides that they want to grow rapidly by exploiting those minerals more quickly, they're the only exporter. But if they do that, they're going to have export bias growth. The relative supply would increase, and the relative price on the world market would fall. In this particular case, it would be almost impossible for there to be import bias growth. I mean, in the rest of the world, right? I mean, if I'm the United States, I can't grow very rapidly by exploiting rare earth minerals because guess what? I don't have very many of them. So you get an unbalanced situation. You can also, of course, exercise, if you own 95% of the world's production, you can also exercise some monopoly power by reducing your production and driving your relative price up. So all those things would still be possible. Okay, anything else? No, that's not good. Okay, so let's talk now about the effect that we would have if we had tariffs or export subsidies being implemented. So just to define a few things, a tariff is simply a tax on imports. And we'll talk about tariffs and the different forms they can take a little bit later. Where an export subsidy is a payment that is made to a firm that actually exports goods. Now, it's important when we think about export subsidies, you only get the subsidy payment if you are exporting the good, not just because you're producing it, only if you're exporting it. So when we have tariffs and export subsidies, we actually then get a difference between what we call external prices, that is the world relative price, and what we want to think of as internal prices, the prices inside the country. Now remember, domestic consumers and producers will respond to internal prices. Those are the prices that exist inside the country, so they're the only ones that domestic producers and consumers can actually respond to. So external prices will be the prices that international exchange takes place. So those are the prices that we end up with where international actors respond. So we'll need to look at those differences. So let's think about a tariff first. And let's think about Portugal imposing a 20% tariff on wine. Now, we can think about the internal price, and we can think about the external price. Now, the external price is the price of cloth divided by the price of wine. And before the imposition of the tariff, that's the price that would also exist inside the country. But notice now we're going to impose a 20% tariff on wine. The tariff on wine increases the domestic price of wine. So now the internal price becomes 1.2 times the price of wine, which gives us a lower relative price than on the world market. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize, if we place a 20% tariff on imports, the domestic products that compete against those imports will also rise by 20%. Okay? If we've got a 20% tariff on imported wine, the price of domestically produced wine will also go up by 20%. Right? Manufacturers are saying, wait, I can charge the same price as imported wine. So unless this is what we call prohibitive tariff and no wine comes in at all, then we're going to end up with the law of one price, and domestic wine is going to be selling for exactly what imported wine will with the tariff.
So why would the domestic producers not only charge, let's say, an extra 50%, and then the only ones who sell wine would be still cheaper than the imported wine at 20% tariff? I mean, why would they go all the way up to 20%?
Okay, we'll come back to that in just a second. So if you could just hold that thought, we'll see exactly what happens here. Okay, so when we want to think about the effect, we want to consider what Portugal's domestic producers do when they are faced with